We have the real pleasure today of having Geraldine Knatz here, Dr. Geraldine Knatz, here to do our keynote luncheon presentation. Geraldine is a professor of practice, both in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and in the Department of Public Policy here at Price. So she's split between the two schools. And she teaches an environmental course for us, and I'm forgetting what you teach for engineering, another environmental course, yes. She's been involved in this really interesting kind of evolution of thought on Catalina and Catalina's environmental issues related to cruise and cruise lines. So that's what we're going to hear from today, and I want you all to welcome Geraldine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. So I'm really glad to be here because I've had the opportunity to kind of witness firsthand some policy issues on Catalina Island, and I think there's some fabulous opportunities for research. And so it's what a perfect opportunity to talk to the Emerging Scholars Group about that. So over the course of my career, when I worked at the Port of LA, I had to deal with being a home port as a cruise port. And my biggest challenge was the cruise lines wanted to come in, they wanted to be home ported there, they wanted us to build them $1 million terminals, but they only wanted to commit to bring the ships there 1 or 2 years at a time. And it was very difficult to really make that kind of investment. So I now have a home on Catalina Island, and now I've witnessed firsthand some of the challenges that a port of call port experiences from cruising. So my presentation today is really about a scenario that developed over the past 8 months where the community in Catalina was caught off guard by a doubling of their cruise ship calls without knowing about it, and how that had repercussions for the local government and for the cruise lines as well. So cruising is like the fastest growing, except for this week, the fastest growing leisure tourism. You know, since 1980, it's been growing about 7% a year. Basically, ships sail full. The limit to capacity is how fast they can build these cruise ships, and so they're building them bigger and bigger, holding more passengers. And you know, because the utilization is so high and there's such a demand for cruising, there is now a big issue of over-tourism in the cruise ports. And you hear about a lot of European ports that may be UNESCO, they were originally walled city ports, and you know, like Venice, you know, have 5 or 6 of these mammoth ships coming in, offloading passengers at the same time, and it's basically the communities are starting to push back. So Dubrovnik, Croatia is the first port that I'm aware of where the community, the local government, put in a limit on the number of cruise ships. And as it turns out, in January, Catalina became the second place in the world where they put in a limit on cruise ships. So for who's ever been to Catalina? Okay, so most of you have been there, and some of you haven't. And if you're in the department, I understand there may be a trip in the offing for next year. But for those of you that, and actually I've been there before, but until I spent time living there, I didn't really understand a lot of what's going on. So I need to kind of tell you a little bit about what's going on over there in Catalina. So for those of you that have not been there, you know, it's, you know, 26 miles across the sea, you know, that's, and it's the only island of the Channel Islands that's inhabited, 21 miles long. This is, its width ranges from 7 miles to about a half a mile. And as you can see, it's pretty much mountainous terrain. It's very hilly. And the island has been privately owned since the early days of Mexican rule of California. And for the past 100 years, it's been owned by the Wrigley family of Wrigley chewing gum, although they sold off the gum. And in 1975, Wrigley put 88% of the island into a land conservancy. So 88% is land conservancy, 11% the island, the Wrigley family retained for their own commercial, they have a lot of the commercial lands there and their own operations. And then 1% of the island is owned by people like me who have a house over there. So 4,000 people live on the island, about 90% of them in Avalon, okay? And you can see that, it's basically a 1.5 square mile area. Over here you see some things. This is kind of like the industrial area. That's where like the plants are, the desalination plant and all of that sort of stuff. And then there's a little beach area over here, and then they built some condos over there. But pretty much this is where the population is. Now, commercial establishments are allowed to have an automobile or a truck, but if you live there, you're allowed to have one golf cart. They say there's a waiting list for autos, but it's like 20 years or something like that. So basically everybody has a golf cart. If you're lucky enough to have a car, you can escape this 1.5 mile area and go out into the back country. But you can't do that in a golf cart because the roads are dirt, they're rough. You also have to have a Paradise Pass, which costs over $400 a year, and you have to carry an inordinate amount of car insurance on your vehicle. Not really sure why, because it's not like you're going to run into another vehicle, but it's more than I have on my car here in Long Beach. So the fact that most of the people are kind of I'm surprised to learn. Kids grow up there, they've never been in the backcountry. People pretty much spend their lives within that area there. So since 1989, ships from Carnival, Celebrity, Princess, all of the big lines have called on Avalon. And the pattern for the past several years is they get one ship a week on Monday and one ship a week on Tuesday. Nearly 1 million visitors per year actually travel to the island. Most of them you can see come on the daily ferry. And the ferry comes throughout the day with greater frequency than the cruise ships. And then they also have helicopter service. Actually, the helicopter service, that was the service that was transporting Kobe Bryant. So the helicopter service has been shut down. So Avalon is what we call a tender port. It doesn't have a big berth for the cruise ships to pull in, so the cruise ship sits right off the harbor there, and the people load into small boats called tenders, and they go back and forth. So a ferry, of course, is going to have more passengers than a ferry, but a lot of those people on the ferry are locals that have to travel over to the mainland to go to the doctor or the dentist or to go shopping because, that things are pretty limited on the island. So the city of Avalon has a municipal code for waterside permits to grant the authority for use of harbor facilities. And so if a cruise line wants to call at Avalon, they call up the harbor master, say, I want to bring a ship in on, every whatever. And the harbor master will kind of look at the schedule and he'll say yes or no. And there is no written policy on that. It's like developed ad hoc over time. Sometimes they let 2 ships in on a day and the community was screaming. Sometimes they let ships in on the weekends and the community was screaming. So he's kind of worked out sort of, weekdays are good, no weekends, especially no weekends in the summer season. So what happened was in August 2019, Royal Caribbean Line requested to call on every Wednesday and every Saturday. And so consistent with what the harbor master normally does, he approved Wednesday and he denied Saturday. And but the community learned about it later. But what this meant for the community is that instead of 2 days a week that cruise ships are in, 3 days a week cruise ships are in. So to them, that's a 50% in the number of cruise ships. So a little bit about Avalon. It's a small city. They have a small budget. Based on people that study tourism, there's a tourism area life cycle model. And, Avalon's already passed through the exploratory phase, the involvement phase, the development phase, consolidation, stagnation, and decline. It went through all those phases and it went into decline. The peak period for Avalon was in the 50s and the 40s when it was the playground for Hollywood movie stars. And so then it stagnated and then it declined. And in the winter months, everything pretty much shut down. So in fact, the movement into rejuvenation of the tourism business really came about because the cruise ships started coming in 1989. Also, the Conservancy and the Wrigley family started to invest a lot in ecotourism. So, but many businesses in the winter still struggle to employ people full time. So tourism-related businesses, as you would expect, love cruise ship passengers. It allows them to provide more jobs in the hospitality industry, and city leaders, like cruise business because it allows them a chance to increase their revenues. Now, based on a survey done in 2016, the average spending by a day tripper to island, whether they were on the cruise ship or the ferry, was $82. And then overnight visitors spend more. They spend about $194 a day, and so there is some if we can introduce somebody through a cruise ship and bring them back, that may be a way to increase revenue. There's a lot of research done on economic benefits of tourism. It's only more recently that research has shifted to the economic impacts, residential perceptions of being a tourist destination, and so that is a really growing field. Now, there's very little research done on tender ports. I found one study where some academic researchers looked at spending at a tender port versus where the ship can come in and berth on a cruise around Ireland. Unfortunately for these researchers, they had to take the cruise and get off at every port and then, survey the people. And they did find that at a tender port, people spend less because they spend about an hour time lining up to go back to the boat. And so that cuts into their shopping time. What happened when the community heard about this? Well, in many ports of call, local residents have learned to avoid the downtown area when cruise ships are in. But Avalon has one grocery store, one pharmacy, one general store, one post office. Residents are so much trapped in that 1.5 square mile, you really can't get away from the ships. You're only allowed to have one golf cart per house, and there are permits for 140 golf carts on the island that can be rented. But on a Monday and Tuesday, as soon as they get off the cruise ship, the passengers line up and they rent every golf cart. So if for some reason it's too far to walk and your husband has to go one way and you have to go one way, there's no golf carts to rent. The biggest, the issues raised by the community are crowding, refuse. They have a wireless system over there. It gets overloaded. Water issues, infrastructure. And I would say water and really housing are some of the biggest challenges faced on the island. Until about a year ago, when we had the major drought, we were in stage 3 water rationing on the island, and we were limited to 40 gallons per person per day. Hotels had to ship their linen on barge back to Long Beach to get it washed and then bring it back again. Not exactly sustainable. Construction contractors had to bring their water over on barge to mix concrete on the island. Although the toilets flush with water, with seawater, if you want to, I've actually been on a waiting list for 2 years for a water allotment to add a bedroom to my house. The toilets flush with seawater, but there's limited potable water, and that's how they control growth by, you have to get in a water allotment to do construction. So obviously cruise ships are not going to use as much potable water as people that check into a hotel and run a shower, but the community's really grabbed onto the cruise ship issue as the big issue. This, by the way, is my faucet off my little front patio area, and it's got a lock on it. So when I got the house, I saw, why do these people have locks on their faucets? And I didn't have a lock on my faucet. Well, I found out soon enough, people were coming over to my faucet and washing, basically stealing my water. So now I have a lock on my faucet. So, among ocean-going vessels, we port people considered cruise ships the worst polluters because they're packed with thousands of passengers and 1,000 or more crew, and everybody's plugging stuff in to electrical power, and they use a lot of power. And so, at large urban ports, cruise ships now hook to shoreside electrical power and shut down their engines. And that was something that was really pioneered here at the Port of Los Angeles. But the tender ports in Avalon, the ship has to sit there in the harbor running its engine because they can't hook to shoreside electrical power. So my house is way up on the hill. From my patio, my deck, I can hear the loudspeaker on the cruise ship out in the harbor, line up, whatever. So I sat through hours of public hearings about this issue over the last 8 months, and hotel managers would tell the city council, hey, when people call to make a reservation, they ask, well, what are the cruise ship days? Because they don't want to come on those days because they think the downtown is too crowded. And residents also don't understand why they don't see more of Carnival being a member of, say, their Chamber of Commerce and things like that. The other thing that the community latched onto is the negative press that the cruise lines get. So this is the scorecard that's developed by Friends of the Earth, where they rank all the cruise ships, and let's face it, Carnival is down here at the bottom. Their overall score is an F. Okay, and they look at things like criminal violations is why they're making the news. And that's another thing that the public grabs onto. Disney, of course, gets an A. So what does the literature say about the impacts of cruising? A lot of the literature focuses on things like air pollution and stuff like that. But there is now more literature that really deals with residents' perceptions of cruising. And so I immersed myself in that literature, and there's a considerable lot out there on being a tourist destination and dealing with residents' perceptions. There's a smaller subset on island tourism, and then, as I said, even a smaller subset on tender ports. But this one paper done by Garcia, where I have the citation up there, this group really evaluated all the literature up through 2015, pretty much found that there's a lot of contradictory results in terms of what are the factors that drive people's residents' perception about the cruise industry and the tourism in generally. On the whole, however, the conclusion of many papers were, and a lot of them do survey models and algorithms and whatever, and they come up with the answer, which to me is pretty obvious. If you're in a business that's tourism oriented, you like the cruise ships. If you're not, you don't like the cruise ships. But in other cases, factors that have been shown to influence attitudes are age, income, length of residency, ethnicity, education, gender, and distance from the tourism site. So this is a real case of a governance issue kind of blowing up in your face. Nearly every study on tourism says include the local community into the process. This did not happen here at all. The harbor master lives there. The word got out. It's not like the city council had to approve anything, and the community was up in arms. The lack of a written policy was key in raising fear among the residents. They had all these rumors going around. They didn't know because there was no guidance for them. They thought, oh my God, they'll start bringing in a cruise ship every day, so they were all up in arms about that. So many of the community concerns turned out to be unfounded, but the city council asked for ideas from the community on what they should do in terms of developing a policy. So that was a real positive. And those responses came in the form of emails and letters. And they published all of them. I was able to read all of them. But to know that you should submit a comment, you had to have been at the council meeting or have watched the council meeting. I sat through hours of public hearing, and the majority of the speakers were white, yet the population of Avalon is 68.9% Hispanic. And so, and nothing on the website is in Spanish. Okay, and I think the city council even recognized we're not hearing from everybody. So what about other tender ports in California? There's other places that cruise ships pull into where they don't have big berthing facilities. So Monterey and Santa Barbara being two of them. And if you look at, kind of compare some of those things, you can see that, oh my God, Avalon gets a lot more cruise ships. They have a lot smaller population. In the other cities, Santa Barbara and Monterey, you can get in your car and you can drive away to another grocery store. You don't have to go to the one main street in town. And the other thing that became fairly obvious is that the passenger rate was much lower than the other ports. So the cruise ships coming into Catalina are 3,600 passengers. That's like almost the entire population of the island. Now, not all of them get off, but it's a significant number. So the other thing that community members learned about was marketing incentives. Cruise lines always ask ports for marketing incentives. This used to make me insane. It was a way for a cruise line to leverage a port. Cruise ships are movable assets. So it's like, you were glad to land one at your home port to help pay, for the infrastructure you put in. But, they always come up with a reason for you to, for them to pay you less in the passenger fee. So in Avalon, the cruise lines, if you bring a second ship, you only pay 50% of the wharfage rate per passenger. So when Carnival comes in on Tuesday, instead of $4.50 a person, they get $2.25 for every passenger on the ship. So the average citizen is like, we don't get this marketing incentive thing, and obviously that's going to be, the city council realizes that has to be re-examined. So on January 21st, they adopted a policy. They had already told the three lines that, 3 ships are coming in, so the policy was 3 ships a week. They didn't limit the number of passengers, but they believe that, they're not going to get 5,000 and 6,000 passenger ships because as a tender port, you've got to line people up on your ship and get them in these little boats and ferry them back and forth. And so there's a natural limitation. A big ship is not going to want to tender that many people. So that's the policy that had adopted. So is that a big deal? Well, what does it mean? The Port of Los Angeles just a few months ago sent out a proposal to the cruise lines to build 2 new cruise berths. But Los Angeles has always been a destination for cruise home port. And what that means is they have limited options for cruise, okay? They can pretty much, the livelihood of the Los Angeles cruise terminal is pretty much tied to Mexico. And when crime became an issue in Mexico, the cruise lines, that's when Disney pulled out of LA. They weren't going to risk anything there. Economic downturn, it went down. So you can see that LA's, goes up and down for cruise businesses. So, and some of you may not realize, but it's 100 years old now. The Merchant Marine Act of 1920 has a portion of it called the Jones Act, which limits foreign flag vessels from calling from one U.S. port to another U.S. port. So when I say Los Angeles destination port, you can't take a cruise ship out of L.A. and go to San Francisco and then go to Seattle and then go to Anchorage. You can go to, you can leave L.A. and go to Canada and then go to Alaska. You can leave LA and go to Mexico and then go to Avalon. You've got to intersperse a foreign port in between calling on 2 U.S. ports. And that's been an issue the cruise industry has raised for years, but I don't know that that's ever going to change. So right now, Disney wants to bring cruise ships into Disney's come back to the West Coast, but they're going to be at San Diego. They're going to go San Diego, Mexico, and then Avalon. But they just instituted a policy, 3 ships a week, and those are full. So what does that mean? The brand new policy is going to go before City Council, and that should be an interesting meeting, because are they going to revise the policy right after they did it? So future research. In 2021, the cruise ships are going to go up to 160. a lot of, I think there's a period of opportunity for research that tests this policy that's put in place, and also to further clarify the impacts. For example, there was no comprehensive survey on community members, and I think the city would look, which has no money, might look favorably on research from help from academics. Research on residents' attitudes on tourism have identified a number of factors that can play a role in a specific port city. It might be distance, living from the port, gender, economic status, those things I've mentioned before. My observations lead me to believe that in this case, residents' perceptions about tourism impact should be examined based on the length of time that family's lived on the island. So many people got up at the public meetings, council meetings, and like, I've been living on this island for 5 generations. I've been living on this island for 4 generations. That's not that common in LA. So it was something that was, oh, that's a little different. I also believe examining perspectives based on gender might also be interesting in this case. And, as the research has showed, every locality is different, and those of us in the port business always say, if you've seen one port, you see one port, because they're not all the same. And so this locality has that situation where the residents are pretty much captive to a small area, and I think that is a condition that affects their views on the cruising industry. So hopefully I have enticed some of you to I know there's so many policy and transportation issues to study in LA. You don't have to look 26 miles across the street, but you might want to. There's some neat stuff going on over there. So thank you.
So I sail there, and I want to understand how the community that looks at sailing-based tourism, do they like it, not like it, or what's the difference between their perception of sailing and cruise ships?
Yeah, I didn't come across anything on that specifically, but based as being a resident, do you have a mooring or you just sail over there?
We sail over there. We call the harbor master, and it's usually 2 harbors that we go to. But
oh, okay. So you're over on
Avalon
in other
is usually
areas.
too crowded, as you said.
Yeah, there. The Catalina is an interesting place. It's so expensive to go to. It's cheaper to take a cruise out of Long Beach to Mexico and then to Avalon than it is to take the ferry over and go into a hotel. That's how expensive the island is. So there is a lot of boating traffic that goes back and forth from LA, and they go in all the coves. The moorings are outrageously expensive, and you can go online and see a lot of them for sale, over $1 million, and it's outrageous. But I've never seen anything, and usually you guys are just taking in a little dinghy, right? Yeah. Are you throwing anchor out?
And we have the wind for free, so we don't have to pay too much for ferry.
Yeah, right. You throw your anchor over, and then you got a little dinghy, and you come in, and you get off, and so it's not that much of an impact. I haven't heard anything about that. Well, I would say today I actually looked at the prices for Carnival Cruise. $129 if you want to book a cruise now. Generally, the cheapest ones are $399 going out of Long Beach.
A few questions, but I guess I'll start with, in your judgment, given the residents who are there now, what came first, the residents or the tourism? Did the residents go there with the understanding that there was tourism, or did they not?
I would say the residents, let me tell you a little bit about the history of the island. Originally, it was used for mining, marble, sandstone, cattle grazing and sheep grazing. Those were the core businesses there. Then when it was owned by the Banning family before it was sold to the Wrigley family, the Banning family bought it in, the Wrigley's got it in the 1890s or late 1880s to make it a tourist destination, because they were operating in the harbor and they had these ships and they ran the ferry. There's a fascinating book by Tom Sitton, Grand Ventures that describes this monopoly situation on the whole operation there on Catalina Island. And so, so I would say that it was always really tourism when the population started to grow, because some of the first things built were the hotels, and then they would have tents. You could go over and stay in a tent on the island, in Avalon. So,
how come another grocery store doesn't open away from where all the ports are and like a little bit further away so the residents can get there?
So do you know how many years it took to permit this Vaughn's grocery store? No. There was a little tiny store there, and they had like a 7-Eleven. And I basically would go to Costco and get, a ice thing, and I would bring food over because there was hardly anything over there, limited things. I think it took over 7 years to permit the Vaughn's grocery store. So, because it's right in town, people live like right next to it, but believe it or not, people in Avalon complain about traffic. Honestly, the traffic, they don't like the the gasoline-powered golf carts, okay, because they're noisy and they're loud, and most of the ones for rental are gasoline-powered, and they don't like that, all the traffic when these 140 additional golf carts are driving. They actually complain about traffic. It's funny, I think, living over here, too, so.
Dr. Knatz, are the large herd of buffalo or bison still at the top of the island?
Yes, they are still there. The bison is there. The deer are there. The deer right now, it's really interesting. The bison population had gotten so big that they shipped some off to Montana. They put them on birth control, and then they've only had one live birth for the past couple of years. So now they're a little worried about that. The bison are under control of the Conservancy. The deer are under the control of the California Fish and Wildlife Department. And so the Conservancy manages the population because they're trying to keep the natural ecosystem. They have plants and animals that are indigenous only to that island or the Channel Islands. But the deer have overpopulated. Before I bought my house, somebody told me a deer had actually, because I tend to leave the door open, a deer actually walked into the house. If you have a cat and you put out cat food, the deer is coming down. There's a great picture somebody caught one evening of the deer sticking his head in the Vaughn's grocery store thing. So the deer are like way over a couple thousand. And they do allow hunting over there periodically under permit. You can hunt the deer, but the Conservancy want to take control of the deer population away from the state so they can manage it.
What is the population growth during the summer with all the kids for summer camps and stuff? Is there a large influx of children during the summer?
There is, but they're generally out in the coves. They're not staying in downtown. Sometimes around where the golf course area is, they have a camp. Scouts might camp there, but generally they're way out on the island. They bus them out to these various coves where they have camping facilities.
So you don't feel the effects?
No, that hasn't been an issue. And the Conservancy manages that. You can get in the backcountry, taking an eco tour or whatever. Those are not inexpensive either. So, but that's pretty well managed.